There's nothing more painful than realizing you failed the person who needed you most. For Veronica Lane, that moment came when she saw her 6-year-old son laughing with a stranger. Veronica built a billion-dollar company working 16 hours a day. She told herself it was all for her son, Max. She hired nannies, bought him everything, made sure he was safe. When she came home early that Tuesday, she found Max playing in a kiddie pool in their front yard. A black man she'd never seen was spraying him with a hose. Both were laughing and having fun. Veronica's heart pounded. Who was this stranger with her child? What would she discover about the man who had stepped into the role she'd abandoned before? We jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Veronica Lane's silver business card case held contacts from 43 countries. She knew this because she'd counted them during a particularly tedious board meeting 3 weeks ago, when the quarterly projections had been so stellar that her mind had wandered to inventory. The case itself was a gift from her first major investor, a reminder of how far she'd come from the cramped studio apartment where she'd coded her first app on a second-hand laptop. The apartment she'd shared with Max's father before he decided that fatherhood wasn't compatible with his artistic vision. Now, at 30, Veronica owned a tech empire that employed over 2,000 people across 12 offices. Lane Technologies specialized in productivity software that helped other companies maximize efficiency. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become an expert in helping others organize their lives, while her own had become a precisely calibrated machine running on autopilot. Her Malibu estate sprawled across 3 acres of perfectly manicured landscape. Every morning at 5:30, she walked the same path from her master suite to the kitchen, where Maria, not to be confused with the other Maria who came Wednesdays for deep cleaning, had already prepared her usual breakfast. 2 eggs over easy. Wheat toast, black coffee, no deviation. Efficiency demanded routine. By 6:15, she was reviewing overnight emails from the Tokyo office. By 6:45, she was dressed in one of 12 identical charcoal suits that hung in order of fabric weight in her walk-in closet. By 7:00, she was in her Tesla, navigating morning traffic while conducting her first conference call of the day. The house staff handled everything else. Max's morning routine fell to whichever nanny was currently employed. They cycled through every few months due to what the agency diplomatically called scheduling conflicts. Veronica preferred to think of it as high standards. She paid top dollar for childcare, and she expected results. Max, now 6, had adapted to this rhythm with the resilience that children possess but shouldn't need. He knew which nanny made the best pancakes, Sarah, who'd lasted 4 months, which one helped him with homework without making him feel stupid, Jennifer, terminated after she'd missed 2 days with the flu, and which one let him stay up past his bedtime to watch cartoons. Marcus, wait, that wasn't a nanny. The neighborhood of Bridgewater Heights was exactly what Veronica had envisioned when she'd purchased the house 2 years ago. Quiet streets lined with mature oak trees, houses spaced far enough apart to ensure privacy, and neighbors who minded their own business. The community was successful, professional, and predictably absent during business hours. She knew the basics about her neighbors the way one knows the weather forecast. Useful information, but not requiring deep investment. The Hendersons to the left had 2 teenage daughters who drove matching BMWs. The Chens to the right traveled frequently for work, evidenced by their perpetually rolling suitcases and the packages that accumulated on their porch. Across the street, the Patels had recently renovated their kitchen, a project that had taken 6 months and involved considerable noise during Veronica's few weekend calls from home. What she hadn't noticed until recently was the modest ranch house 3 doors down, where a moving truck had arrived sometime in the spring. The new residents had settled in quietly, without the usual neighborhood introductions or housewarming parties. Veronica had glimpsed a man in the yard occasionally, tall, always in work clothes, often with a small girl who looked to be about Max's age. She'd made a mental note to have someone from her staff drop off a welcoming gift basket, then promptly forgot, as a crisis in the European markets demanded her attention. Max's world was structured with the same efficiency that governed Veronica's business empire. Piano lessons Monday and Wednesday, swimming lessons Tuesday and Thursday, academic tutoring Friday afternoon. Saturday was designated for enrichment activities, museum visits, educational workshops, or cultural events that Veronica had researched and approved but rarely attended. Sunday was theoretically family time, though it usually became catch-up work time, while Max played quietly in his room or watched educational programming in the den. His bedroom was a showcase of thoughtful parenting by proxy. The latest educational toys, carefully selected books arranged by reading level, a computer loaded with approved learning software. Everything a developing mind could need, organized in labeled bins and shelves that made cleanup efficient for whichever staff member was on duty. But efficiency, Veronica was beginning to realize, left little room for the messiness of actual childhood. Max rarely got dirty anymore. His clothes stayed clean, his hair stayed combed, his activities stayed supervised and structured. He was polite to adults, quiet in restaurants, and never caused scenes in public. He was, by all measurable standards, a well-behaved child. He was also, she'd noticed during their brief interactions, becoming increasingly withdrawn. At dinner, when her schedule permitted them to eat together, he answered her questions with single words. How was school? Fine. What did you learn today? Stuff. Are you happy with your current nanny? Okay. She'd mentioned this to Dr. Patel, Max's pediatrician, during his last checkup. Dr. Patel, a gentle man who'd been treating children for 30 years, had asked a few questions about Max's routine, his social interactions, his playtime. Then he'd suggested, with the diplomatic care that medical professionals use when addressing sensitive topics, that perhaps Max might benefit from more unstructured playtime and peer interactions outside of organized activities. Children need time to be bored, he'd said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed Max's growth chart. They need time to discover their own interests, to make their own mistakes, to develop resilience through trial and error. Structure is important, but so is spontaneity. Veronica had nodded and made mental notes about researching additional activities that promoted creativity and independence. She'd missed the point entirely. The nanny situation had become increasingly problematic. The agency, Platinum Childcare Solutions, the most exclusive service in the city, kept providing candidates with impressive credentials and references. Yet none of them lasted more than a few months. They cited various reasons for leaving: family obligations, career changes, better opportunities. But Veronica suspected the real reason was Max himself, or rather, her expectations for how Max should be managed. She wanted someone who could maintain his schedule, support his academic development, and prepare him for the competitive world he'd eventually navigate. Someone who understood that childhood was preparation for adulthood, and that preparation required discipline, structure, and high standards. Someone who wouldn't indulge his occasional tantrums or let him develop bad habits that would be harder to correct later. What she hadn't considered was that she was asking someone else to love her child in a way she'd forgotten how to do herself. The current nanny, Hannah, a 24-year-old with a degree in child development, had seemed promising. She was punctual, professional, and armed with developmental theories and behavior management strategies. Max had been polite to her, which Veronica had interpreted as acceptance. She hadn't noticed that Max's politeness was the careful courtesy of a child who'd learned not to expect emotional connection from the adults in his life. On this particular Tuesday, Veronica had left the office at 3:30 p.m. instead of her usual 7 p.m. The crisis that had prompted her early departure was significant. Their biggest client was threatening to terminate their contract due to a software glitch that had affected their quarterly projections. It was the kind of problem that required immediate hands-on attention from the CEO, the kind of crisis that could cost the company millions if not handled correctly. She'd called ahead to let Hannah know she'd be home early, but the call had gone to voicemail. Not unusual, the nannies were instructed to focus on Max during their shifts, and phone calls could wait unless it was an emergency. Veronica appreciated this policy. It showed proper priorities. She'd planned to spend an hour with Max, review his homework, discuss his day, perhaps read together, before sequestering herself in her home office to handle the client crisis remotely. Quality time, efficiently managed, followed by uninterrupted work time. It was a reasonable plan that balanced her responsibilities as both mother and CEO. But as her Tesla turned into the driveway of her perfectly maintained estate, Veronica saw something that made her slam on the brakes hard enough to trigger the car's safety systems. Her heart began racing, not from the sudden stop, but from the scene unfolding on her immaculate front lawn. There was Max, shirtless and squealing with delight, running through the spray of a garden hose held by a man she'd never seen before. A black man in work clothes and muddy boots, laughing as he chased Max around a bright blue plastic kiddie pool that definitely didn't belong in her landscape design. And Max, her quiet, careful, always clean Max, was laughing in a way she hadn't heard in months, maybe longer. Veronica's hands shook as she turned off the engine. Every instinct screamed danger, stranger, child, vulnerability, threat. Her mind catalogued the possibilities with terrifying efficiency. Kidnapping, assault, worse things she couldn't let herself consider. She fumbled for her phone, ready to dial 911, when Max's laughter stopped her cold. It was pure joy. The kind of uninhibited happiness she'd forgotten children were capable of. The kind she'd been trying to buy him with lessons and tutors and educational experiences that never quite hit the mark. He was running in circles around the kiddie pool, arms spread wide, face turned up to the spray from the hose, completely unself-conscious in a way that was both beautiful and utterly foreign to the Max she knew. The man holding the hose noticed her car first. He straightened, lowering the hose, and said something to Max that made the boy turn around. When Max saw her Tesla in the driveway, his expression shifted from joy to something that looked almost like guilt. He grabbed a towel that was draped over a lawn chair. Where had that lawn chair come from? And wrapped it around himself with quick, efficient movements that spoke of practice. Veronica got out of the car on unsteady legs, her designer heels clicking against the pavement as she approached the scene. The man didn't retreat or appear nervous. Instead, he turned off the hose and set it down carefully, then walked toward her with the confident gait of someone who had nothing to hide. "You must be Max's mom," he said, extending a hand that was calloused but clean. "I'm Marcus Johnson. I live down the street." She stared at his outstretched hand without taking it. "What are you doing with my son?" Marcus's expression remained calm, but she caught a flicker of something, disappointment maybe, before he lowered his hand. Max was wandering down Elm Street about an hour ago. He was crying and said he couldn't find anyone at home. I brought him back here, but nobody answered the door. "That's impossible." The words came out sharper than she intended. "His nanny was supposed to be here." "Hannah always—" "There's no one here but Max," Marcus said gently. "I checked, knocked on the front door, went around back, looked through the garage windows to see if anyone was inside. The house was empty." Veronica's throat tightened. "Max, where's Hannah?" Max, still clutching the towel, looked down at his bare feet. His toenails, she noticed, had dirt under them. When had he last been barefoot outside? "She said she had to leave early. She said you knew." "I didn't." Veronica caught herself before finishing the sentence. She wouldn't discuss staff issues. In front of a stranger, wouldn't give him ammunition to judge her parenting or her household management. "Max, go inside and get dressed. We'll discuss this later." "But I'm not finished playing," Max said, a note of whining creeping into his voice that she rarely heard anymore. Most of his compliance was automatic now, worn smooth by routine and expectation. "The pool needs to be put away," she said, looking at the bright plastic monstrosity that had appeared on her perfect lawn. "This isn't appropriate." "It's my pool," Marcus interjected quietly. "I brought it over when I saw Max was upset. Sometimes kids just need to play in water when they're having a hard day." She turned to stare at him. "You brought a kiddie pool to my house?" "Your son was scared and alone. I did what I thought would help." The simplicity of his answer somehow made it worse. She felt accused, judged, found wanting by a man who didn't even know her. "Max is never alone. He has full-time care, structured activities, everything he needs. Everything except someone who was here when he needed them." The words hit like a physical blow. Veronica felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "You don't know anything about our situation. Max is very well cared for. We have systems in place." "I'm sure you do." Marcus's voice remained level, but there was something in his eyes that made her defensive walls slam up higher. "But systems fail sometimes. Today your system failed, and Max paid the price." "Mommy, can I play for 5 more minutes?" Max's small voice cut through the tension between the adults. He was looking at her with hope she rarely saw anymore, the kind of expectant hope that children have before they learn to manage their disappointment. "No," she said automatically. "It's time to go inside. You're filthy, and you have homework to complete before dinner." Max's face fell, but he nodded with the resignation of a child who'd learned not to argue with the inevitable. He started walking toward the house, the towel dragging behind him. "Max," Marcus called. When the boy turned around, Marcus smiled at him. "Thanks for playing with me today, buddy. That was fun." Max's face lit up again just for a moment. "Thank you for the pool, and for finding me when I was scared. Finding him when he was scared." The words echoed in Veronica's mind as Max disappeared through the front door. Her 6-year-old son had been scared and lost, and a stranger had been the one to comfort him. "How often does this happen?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet now that Max was out of earshot. "This has never happened before," Veronica said. But even as she spoke, she realized she couldn't be completely certain. How would she know? She was never home during the day. Max said Hannah leaves early sometimes. He said he's not supposed to tell you because it makes you angry. She stopped. Hannah did seem to be finishing her shifts earlier recently, but she'd assumed it was because Max was becoming more independent, needing less supervision. The idea that Max had been covering for the nanny's dereliction of duty made her stomach twist. "Look," Marcus said, "I don't want to cause problems for you or Max. I just want to make sure he's safe. Today he wasn't safe. He's perfectly safe." This was an isolated incident with the nanny, which I'll address immediately. "Will you?" The question stopped her short. There was no challenge in his voice, no accusation, just genuine curiosity. But it forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth that addressing the nanny situation meant acknowledging that she'd been failing at something she'd thought she'd solved with money and careful planning. "Of course I will," she said stiffly. "I appreciate your concern, but Max is my responsibility." "You're right," Marcus agreed. "He is." The way he said it, not angry, not judgmental, just matter of fact, made her feel smaller than any accusation could have. She wanted to say something cutting, something that would put this stranger in his place and re-establish her authority over the situation. Instead, she found herself asking, "How did you know he was my son?" "He looks like you," Marcus said simply. "Same eyes, same stubborn chin, and he talks about you a lot." "He does? He says you're very important and very busy. He says you work harder than anyone else in the world so you can take care of him." Marcus paused. "He's proud of you." The words should have made her feel better, but they didn't. They made her feel hollow, like she'd been surviving on a diet of artificial sweetener while her son starved for something real. "I should go check on him," she said, taking a step toward the house. "Mrs. Lane?" Marcus called. She turned back. "His shoes are still muddy from when I found him. You might want to ask him where he was walking to." She watched him gather up the kiddie pool and the lawn chair, loading them into a pickup truck that was parked on the street. A working truck, she noted automatically. Construction company logo on the side. Honest work, her grandmother would have called it, back when Veronica had known the difference between honest work and important work. As Marcus drove away, Veronica stood in her driveway and tried to remember the last time she'd seen Max laugh like that. The memory wouldn't come. Inside the house, Veronica found Max in his bathroom, carefully washing the dirt from between his toes. The sight of him being so methodical about cleaning himself, something she'd drilled into him through countless evening routines, made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. "Max," she said, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, "tell me about Hannah leaving early." His shoulders tensed, but he kept washing his feet. "She said she had an important appointment. She said you wouldn't mind. How many times has she left early?" Max's hands stilled under the running water. She could see him calculating, trying to figure out the right answer, not the truthful one, but the one that would cause the least trouble. The fact that her 6-year-old had learned to think this way made her feel sick. "You won't get mad?" he asked without looking up. "I won't get mad at you. 3 times, maybe 4. She always says you know about it." Veronica closed her eyes. Hannah had been with them for 2 months, which meant she'd been abandoning Max roughly once every 2 weeks. "Where do you go when she leaves?" "Usually I just stay in my room and watch videos on my tablet. But today I wanted to find her car to see if she was still here, and I got confused about which direction she went." Max finally looked at her, his brown eyes, so much like her own, wide with worry. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby, you're not in trouble." The endearment slipped out naturally, surprising them both. When had she stopped calling him baby? "You did the right thing by staying close to home, and Marcus was right to help you." "Marcus is really nice," Max said, brightening. "He has a daughter named Zoe, who's in 1st grade like me, but at a different school. She comes to his work sometimes, and he lets her help him with safe stuff like organizing his tools. He brings his daughter to work on days when school is closed, but he still has to work. He says that's what dads do. They figure out how to take care of their kids no matter what." Max dried his feet with a towel. "Why doesn't my dad do that?" The question hit her like cold water. Max rarely asked about his father anymore, not since she'd explained 2 years ago that some people weren't ready to be parents, and that it was better to have one parent who loved you completely than 2 parents where one wasn't sure. "Your father made different choices," she said carefully, "but you have me and I love you completely." "I know," Max said, but there was something in his voice that suggested knowing and feeling weren't quite the same thing. That evening, after calling Hannah to terminate her employment, a conversation that revealed Hannah had been taking a second job during her contracted hours with Max, Veronica found herself walking down the street toward Marcus's house. She told herself she was going to return his lawn chair, which he'd forgotten when he loaded the kiddie pool. But really, she needed to understand who this man was who'd stepped into her son's life so naturally. The house was smaller than the others. In the neighborhood, a ranch-style home with a modest front yard where a small girl was drawing with chalk on the driveway. The girl looked up as Veronica approached, taking in her business attire with curious eyes. "Are you Max's mom?" the girl asked. "I'm Zoe. Max told my daddy about you." "What did he tell your daddy about me?" "That you're very smart and very beautiful, but also very sad sometimes." Before Veronica could process this observation, Marcus appeared in the doorway, apparently drawn by the sound of voices. He'd changed out of his work clothes into jeans and a t-shirt, and she noticed for the first time that he was younger than she'd initially thought. Maybe mid-30s, with kind eyes and an easy smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Mrs. Lane," he said, walking down the driveway toward them. "Everything okay?" She held up the lawn chair. "You forgot this." "Thanks, but you didn't need to walk it over. I would have gotten it tomorrow." He took the chair from her, their hands brushing. Briefly, his skin was warm and slightly rough from manual work. "How's Max doing?" "He's fine. I terminated his nanny's employment." Marcus nodded without surprise. Probably for the best. Max seemed pretty anxious about the whole situation. He told me, "You take Zoe to work sometimes?" "When I have to, yeah. Construction sites aren't ideal for kids, but single parents do what they have to do." He glanced at Zoe, who had gone back to her chalk art. "Her mom died when she was 3, cancer. It's been just us for the last 3 years." The simple way he stated the facts, no self-pity, no bid for sympathy, made Veronica respect him despite herself. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. It's been hard, but we're managing. Kids are more resilient than we think." He looked back at her. "Max is a great kid, by the way. Polite, smart, thoughtful. You should be proud." "I am proud of him," she said, then found herself adding, "But I'm not sure I deserve the credit. I haven't been... I work a lot. Most parents work a lot these days. It's tough to balance everything." His lack of judgment should have been reassuring, but instead, it made her want to confess things she'd barely admitted to herself. "I don't think I know how to balance anything anymore. I built a company that helps other people be more efficient with their time, but I can't figure out how to spend time with my own son." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching Zoe add flowers to her chalk garden. "You want some advice from someone who learned the hard way?" She nodded. "Stop trying to optimize childhood. Kids don't need efficiency. They need presence. They need someone who shows up not because it's scheduled, but because they matter more than whatever else is demanding your attention." That's easier said than done when you're responsible for thousands of employees and millions in revenue. "I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's necessary." Marcus sat down on his front steps, gesturing for her to join him. After a moment's hesitation, she did, feeling strange to be sitting on concrete steps in her designer suit. "When Sarah, Zoe's mom, was dying, she made me promise something. She said, 'Don't let work be your way of hiding from life.' Zoe needs a father, not a provider." Veronica watched Zoe add a rainbow to her chalk masterpiece, completely absorbed in her art. "What did you do?" "I changed everything. Started my own small construction business instead of working for a big company. Took on projects that let me have flexible hours. Made less money but gained something more valuable." "What's that?" Marcus smiled, watching his daughter. "I gained a relationship with my kid instead of just responsibility for her." The next morning, Veronica hired a private investigator before she hired a new nanny. She told herself it was due diligence. Any responsible parent would want to know more about someone who'd had unsupervised access to their child. But truthfully, Marcus's easy confidence with Max had unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. By Thursday, she had a comprehensive report on Marcus Johnson, 34 years old, owner of Johnson Construction, a small but reputable company specializing in residential renovations. Clean criminal background, excellent credit, active member of Zoe's school PTA, widowed 3 years ago when his wife Sarah died of ovarian cancer. The report painted a picture of a man who was exactly what he appeared to be, a decent single father doing his best. The report made her feel foolish for ordering it and slightly ashamed of her suspicions. Meanwhile, the new nanny situation was proving challenging. Platinum Childcare had sent 3 candidates, each more impressive than Hannah on paper. But Max had greeted each one with polite disinterest that somehow felt worse than outright rejection. When she'd asked him why he didn't seem excited about having help with homework and activities, he'd shrugged and said, "They're fine, I guess. They just don't laugh at my jokes like Marcus did." On Friday afternoon, Veronica left the office early. Again, this time intentionally, to pick Max up from school herself. She found him waiting by the designated pickup spot, his backpack properly zipped and his hair neatly combed. He looked surprised to see her car in the pickup line. "Where's Rachel?" he asked, sliding into his car seat with practiced efficiency. Rachel was the latest nanny candidate, a former elementary school teacher with stellar references. "I thought we could spend some time together this afternoon," Veronica said, watching his face in the rearview mirror. "Maybe get ice cream." Max's eyes widened. On a Friday? The fact that ice cream on a weekday seemed remarkable to him made her chest ache. "Why not?" At the ice cream parlor, Max chose a cone with 2 scoops, chocolate and strawberry. And for the first time in months, Veronica didn't mention the sugar content or suggest he choose fruit instead. They sat at a small table by the window, and she watched him attack his ice cream with the focused intensity that children bring to truly important tasks. "Max," she said carefully, "are you happy?" He paused mid-lick, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Most of the time. What about the times when you're not happy?" "Sometimes I get lonely," he admitted, then quickly added, "But I know you're working hard for us, so it's okay." The casual way he absolved her made everything worse. "It's not okay for you to be lonely, baby. Loneliness is never okay. Rachel says loneliness builds character." Veronica made a mental note to have another conversation with Rachel about her childcare philosophy. "What makes you feel less lonely?" Max thought about this while strawberry ice cream dripped onto his hand. "Playing with Zoe. She doesn't care. If my clothes get dirty, and she knows lots of games that don't need tablets or anything, and Marcus tells really funny stories about when he was little." "You've been playing with Zoe?" "When Rachel takes me to the park, sometimes they're there. Marcus brings Zoe after her school gets out, and they always ask if I want to play with them." Max looked at her uncertainly. "Is that okay?" "Of course it's okay," she said, though something twisted in her stomach at the realization that Marcus and Zoe had become regular parts of Max's day without her knowledge. "Tell me about these funny stories Marcus tells." Max's whole face lit up. "He told us about when he was 7 and he tried to build a rocket ship in his backyard using his mum's pots and pans and some fireworks he found in the garage. He said the rocket didn't work, but it made a hole in the fence that his parents still talk about." Veronica tried to imagine herself sharing similar stories from her childhood with Max, but most of her early memories involved studying, working, part-time jobs, or trying to stay out of the way when her parents fought about money. She'd built her adult life specifically to avoid the chaos and uncertainty of her childhood, but maybe in doing so, she'd also eliminated the joy and spontaneity. "Do you have funny stories from when you were little?" Max asked, as if reading her thoughts. She paused, really thinking about it. "I remember when I was about your age, I tried to teach myself to cook by watching TV shows. I wanted to make your grandmother a birthday cake, but I didn't understand that you had to crack the eggs, not just put them in the bowl hole. The cake was, well, it was inedible, but your grandmother ate a piece anyway and said it was the most thoughtful gift she'd ever received." Max giggled. "Did the eggshells crunch?" "Terribly." But she pretended not to notice. "I want to make you a birthday cake," Max announced, "with Marcus and Zoe's help because they're good at cooking." The casual way he included Marcus and Zoe in his plans for her birthday, still 3 months away, made Veronica realize how much her son's social world had expanded beyond her awareness. Instead of feeling threatened, she found herself curious. "What else do you do with Marcus and Zoe?" "Last week, Marcus showed us how to skip rocks at the pond in Riverside Park. He said his dad taught him when he was little, and someday he'll teach his grandkids too. He says that's how good things get passed down from one person to the next to the next." Max continued chatting about Marcus and Zoe while he finished his ice cream, and Veronica found herself paying attention not just to what he said, but how he said it. There was an animation in his voice when he talked about them that was usually absent from his reports about school or activities. He laughed more in 30 minutes of ice cream conversation than she'd heard in the past month combined. When they got home, Rachel was waiting with a detailed report of Max's academic progress and a proposed schedule for weekend enrichment activities. As Veronica reviewed the typed pages, complete with learning objectives and assessment metrics, she found herself thinking about Marcus's advice to stop trying to optimize childhood. That evening, after Rachel left and Max was supposedly doing his homework, Veronica heard an unfamiliar sound from his room. She walked quietly down the hallway and found him at his desk, but instead of working on math problems, he was drawing with crayons. The picture showed three figures, a tall man pushing a small boy on a swing, while a girl with pigtails cheered from nearby. In the bottom corner, in Max's careful first-grade handwriting, he'd written, "My best day." It was the first drawing he'd made of people in months, and none of the people in the picture were her. The private investigator's report on Marcus had been thorough, but it was the personal references that stuck with Veronica through the weekend. His former supervisor at the construction company where he'd worked before starting his own business had called him the kind of guy you'd trust with your life and your wife. A neighbor described him as the first person to shovel your driveway after a snowstorm and the last to ask for anything in return. The principal at Zoe's school had said, "Mr. Johnson sets the standard for involved parenting. We're lucky to have him in our community." The report had also revealed something Veronica hadn't expected. Marcus made less in a year than she sometimes spent on a single business dinner. Yet, according to every person interviewed, he seemed content with his life in a way that her wealth had never bought her. On Saturday morning, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Mrs. Lane, this is Marcus. Max mentioned you like coffee. I'm taking the kids to get hot chocolate at Murphy's Cafe around 10 if you'd like to. Join us. No pressure. I know weekends are probably busy for you." She stared at the message for several minutes. Coffee at Murphy's wasn't on Max's schedule. Saturday mornings were designated for piano practice, followed by educational museum visits or cultural enrichment activities. She had a conference call with the London office at 11 a.m. and 3 hours of reports to review before Monday's board meeting. But Max was in the kitchen, eating cereal and humming, actually humming, while he read the back of the cereal box. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard him hum. "Max," she called, "would you like to get hot chocolate this morning instead of piano practice?" His spoon clattered into his bowl. "Really? Really?" The private investigator's report on Marcus had been thorough, but it was the personal references that stuck with Veronica through the weekend. His former supervisor at the construction company, where he'd worked before starting his own business, had called him the kind of guy you'd trust with your life and your wife. A neighbor described him as the first person to shovel your driveway after a snowstorm and the last to ask for anything in return. The principal at Zoe's school had said, "Mr. Johnson sets the standard for involved parenting. We're lucky to have him in our community." The report had also revealed something Veronica hadn't expected. Marcus made less in a year than she sometimes spent on a single business dinner. Yet, according to every person interviewed, he seemed content with his life in a way that her wealth had never bought her. On Saturday morning, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Mrs. Lane, this is Marcus. Max mentioned you like coffee. I'm taking the kids to get hot chocolate at Murphy's Cafe around 10 if you'd like to. Join us. No pressure. I know weekends are probably busy for you." She stared at the message for several minutes. Coffee at Murphy's wasn't on Max's schedule. Saturday mornings were designated for piano practice, followed by educational museum visits or cultural enrichment activities. She had a conference call with the London office at 11 a.m. and 3 hours of reports to review before Monday's board meeting. But Max was in the kitchen, eating cereal and humming, actually humming, while he read the back of the cereal box. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard him hum. "Max," she called, "would you like to get hot chocolate this morning instead of piano practice?" His spoon clattered into his bowl. "Really? Really?" Murphy's Cafe occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house in the older part of town, the kind of neighborhood where people walked to the grocery store and knew their postal carrier's name. Veronica felt conspicuous, pulling her Tesla into a parking spot between a Honda Civic with a dented bumper and a pickup truck held together with rust and determination. Inside, the cafe was warm and crowded, filled with families, students with laptops, and elderly couples sharing newspapers. The air smelled of coffee beans and cinnamon rolls, and every surface seemed to have accumulated years of comfortable wear. It was the opposite of the sleek, modern restaurants where Veronica usually conducted business meetings. She spotted Marcus and Zoe at a corner table, Zoe's legs swinging freely from a chair that was too high for her. When Max saw them, he broke away from Veronica and ran over, sliding into the empty chair next to Zoe like he'd done it 100 times before. "Mrs. Lane." Marcus stood as she approached, pulling out a chair for her. The gesture was old-fashioned and unnecessary, but somehow it made her feel more settled. "Thanks for coming. I wasn't sure you'd be able to make it." "Neither was I," she admitted, sitting down. "I cancelled a conference call." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. Instead, he signaled the waitress, a teenager with purple hair and a warm smile, who clearly knew both children by name. "The usual for you two?" the girl asked Max and Zoe. They nodded enthusiastically. "What's the usual?" Veronica asked. "Hot chocolate, with extra whipped cream and those little marshmallows that look like snowflakes," Zoe explained seriously. "And Max always gets a blueberry muffin to share with me because I like the blueberries, but not the muffin part." The casual intimacy of their established routine made Veronica realize how much of Max's social life had developed beyond her awareness. "How long have you been coming here?" "A few weeks," Marcus said. "Ever since Zoe discovered they make hot chocolate with real chocolate instead of powder. It's become our Saturday morning tradition." Veronica's phone vibrated with a text message, probably about the conference call she'd cancelled. She glanced at it automatically, then forced herself to put the phone face down on the table. "Saturday morning traditions sound nice." "What are your Saturday morning traditions?" Zoe asked with the direct curiosity that children possess before. "They learn that some questions make adults uncomfortable." Veronica looked at Max, who was carefully avoiding eye contact. "We usually have piano practice, and then we visit museums or educational centers." "That sounds very smart," Zoe said diplomatically. "But do you have fun traditions too?" The question hung in the air while Veronica tried to think of an answer that wouldn't reveal how structured and joyless their weekends had become. The truth was that she'd optimized their time together for learning and development, but she'd forgotten to optimize for happiness. "We're working on that," she said finally. The hot chocolate arrived in oversized mugs with peaks of whipped cream that defied gravity. Max and Zoe immediately began comparing whose had more marshmallows, a negotiation that involved trading and counting and complete absorption in the moment. Watching them, Veronica felt something she hadn't experienced in years: envy of a 6-year-old's ability to be fully present. "You look like you're thinking pretty hard about something," Marcus observed, stirring his coffee. "I'm thinking about how I've never seen Max negotiate before," she said. "At home, he just accepts whatever he's given. He never asks for more marshmallows or extra whipped cream. He never asks for anything extra." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the children. Maybe he's learned that asking doesn't change anything. The observation stung because it felt true. Max had learned to accept the schedule, the activities, the nannies, the structured interactions with his mother. He'd learned to be grateful for what he received and not to expect spontaneity or negotiation, or the kind of small indulgences that made childhood memorable. "How do I change that?" she asked, surprising herself with the vulnerability in her voice. "Start small," Marcus suggested. "Ask him what he wants sometimes, instead of deciding what's best for him. Let him have opinions about things that don't matter in the long run, but matter to him right now, like marshmallows in hot chocolate, like marshmallows in hot chocolate." Her phone vibrated again, and this time she ignored it completely. Across the table, Max was laughing at something Zoe had whispered, his face animated in a way that made him look younger and more carefree. She pulled out her own phone and, without really thinking about it, took a picture of him laughing. The photo was slightly blurry, catching him mid-motion as he leaned towards Zoe. His hair was messy from running around outside, and there was a small streak of whipped cream on his chin. It was completely unlike the carefully posed portraits she usually had taken of him for holiday cards or company newsletters. It was also the most beautiful picture she'd ever taken of her son. "Good photo?" Marcus asked. "The best one I've ever taken of him," she said, looking at the image on her phone screen. "He looks happy. He is happy. Kids are pretty simple that way. Give them attention and acceptance and they bloom. It can't be that simple." "It's not easy," Marcus corrected. "But it is simple. The hard part isn't knowing what kids need. The hard part is being present enough to give it to them." As if to prove his point, Max looked over at her with whipped cream still on his chin and said, "Mom, this is the best Saturday ever. Can we do this again next week?" And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Veronica didn't consult her calendar before answering. "Yes," she said, "we can do this again next week." The following Tuesday, Veronica left the office at 4 p.m. instead of 7 p.m. She told herself it was a one-time experiment, a way to test whether her presence at home actually made a difference in Max's routine. But truthfully, she'd been thinking about Saturday morning's hot chocolate and the way Max had looked when he laughed, unguarded and genuinely joyful in a way that seemed foreign to their usual interactions. She found Max and Rachel in the kitchen, working through math homework, with the systematic efficiency that Rachel brought to all educational activities. Max was dutifully completing addition problems while Rachel provided encouraging feedback according to current child psychology best practices. "How was school today?" Veronica asked, sitting down at the kitchen island next to Max. Max looked surprised to see her home so early, but answered in his usual careful way. "Fine, we learned about community helpers in social studies." "What kind of community helpers?" "Police officers, firefighters, doctors, teachers." Max paused, pencil hovering over his math sheet. "Marcus came to our class today to talk about construction." Veronica felt a familiar twist in her stomach. "He did? It was career day," Rachel explained. "Parents and community members come in to talk about their jobs. Mr. Johnson was very popular with the children." "What did he talk about?" Veronica asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Max's face lit up, the same expression she'd seen at Murphy's Cafe. "He brought real tools and showed us how to measure boards and use a level to make sure things are straight. And he told us about how buildings start as ideas in someone's head and then become real places where families live and work." "That sounds interesting," Veronica said, though she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. When had someone last asked her to speak at Max's school? She received invitations occasionally, but always declined due to scheduling conflicts. "He said that construction workers are like doctors for buildings," Max continued. "When something is broken or needs fixing, they figure out how to make it strong and safe again." He looked at his mother with serious eyes. "Do you think our house needs fixing?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes it feels kind of quiet and empty, even when people are here." Rachel cleared her throat diplomatically. "Max, perhaps we should focus on finishing your homework before dinner." But Veronica held up a hand to stop her. "No, it's okay. Max, can you tell me more about what you mean by quiet and empty?" Max glanced at Rachel, as if seeking permission to continue a conversation that had moved beyond educational objectives. "It's just that at Zoe's house, people talk to each other a lot. Not just about homework or schedules or being good. They talk about funny things and silly things and things that don't matter except they're thinking about them." "What kind of things?" "Like yesterday, Marcus and Zoe had a whole conversation about what would happen if dogs could drive cars. They made up voices for the dogs and talked about what kind of music they would listen to on the radio." Max's voice became more animated as he continued. "And then Zoe said that her dog Princess would definitely drive a convertible because she likes her ears to flap in the wind." And Marcus laughed so hard he almost choked on his sandwich. Veronica tried to remember the last time she'd had a nonsensical conversation with Max about anything, dogs, driving cars, or otherwise. Their interactions tended to focus on practical matters, school performance, behavior expectations, schedule changes. When had she stopped being silly with her own son? "That does sound fun," she said carefully. "Would you like to have more conversations like that?" Max nodded eagerly, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, if it's okay, I know you're very busy with important work." The way he qualified his desire, always making sure to acknowledge her priorities, made her chest ache. "Max, my work is important, but you're more important. You know that, right?" "I know you love me," Max said, which wasn't quite the same thing. That evening, after Rachel left and Max was theoretically ready for bed, Veronica found herself sitting on the edge of his bed instead of retreating to her home office. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done bedtime routine herself. "Max," she said, "if dogs could drive cars, what kind of car do you think they'd choose?" His eyes widened with surprise and delight. "Really? We can talk about that? Really? Okay. So I think big dogs like Great Danes would drive trucks because they need lots of room, but little dogs like Chihuahuas would drive those tiny smart cars because they match their size." Max was warming to the topic, his earlier bedtime drowsiness forgotten. "And golden retrievers would definitely drive station wagons because they love carrying things around." "Or what about bulldogs?" Max giggled. "Bulldogs would drive really slow cars because they're not in a hurry for anything. But they'd have really good air conditioning because they get hot easily." They continued the conversation for 20 minutes, building an elaborate fantasy about canine transportation preferences that served absolutely no educational purpose and accomplished nothing related to Max's development or future success. It was, Veronica realized, the most fun she'd had in months. The next day, she found herself leaving work even earlier, arriving home in time to help Max with his afternoon snack. Instead of delegating the task to Rachel, she stood in the kitchen with Max, making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, while he told her about his day. "Marcus taught me how to whistle," Max announced, then demonstrated with a series of breathy sounds that didn't quite achieve the desired effect. "I'm not very good yet, but he says it takes practice." "When did you see Marcus?" "At the park after school. Rachel takes me there sometimes, and Marcus and Zoe are usually there too." Max paused in his whistling attempts. "Rachel says Marcus asks about you sometimes." "He does? He asks if you're doing okay and if work is still very stressful. He says sometimes grown-ups forget to take care of themselves when they're busy taking care of everyone else." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. "What do you tell him?" "I tell him you're very strong and very smart, but maybe a little lonely too." The sandwich-making froze. "You think I'm lonely?" Max considered this seriously, his small hands still working with the peanut butter jar. "You don't laugh very much anymore, and you don't have friends who come over to visit." "Marcus has lots of friends who come over for barbecues and to watch football games." That evening, Veronica found herself walking down the street toward Marcus's house, carrying a recipe card she'd found in her kitchen drawer, her own grandmother's. Mac and cheese recipe written in faded blue ink. She'd intended to make it for Max, but realized she'd forgotten how. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to ask a construction worker for cooking advice. Marcus answered the door in work clothes, his face tired but welcoming. "Mrs. Lane, everything okay? I was wondering." She held up the recipe card. "This is my grandmother's mac and cheese recipe, but I can't read all the instructions. The ink has faded, and I thought maybe—" She stopped, realizing how foolish she sounded. "Actually, this is silly. I should just look up a recipe online." "No." "Wait," Marcus said, stepping aside to let her in. "I love old family recipes. My grandmother's biscuit recipe is written on a napkin that's held together with tape. Come on, let's see what we can figure out." In Marcus's kitchen, which was 1/3 the size of her own, but somehow felt warmer and more alive, they studied the recipe card together. Zoe and Max sat at the kitchen table, working on homework and sharing a bowl of apple slices. "This says a good handful of cheese," Marcus observed, squinting at the faded writing. "That's the kind of direction grandmothers give. Not very precise, but somehow always perfect." As they worked to decode her grandmother's cooking instructions, Veronica found herself sharing stories about the woman who'd raised her after her Parents' divorce, who'd always insisted that the secret to good food was cooking with love rather than following recipes exactly. Marcus shared his own grandmother's cooking wisdom, and soon both children were contributing their own observations about the relative merits of different types of cheese. For the first time in years, Veronica felt like she was part of a conversation instead of managing one. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday night. Veronica jerked awake from deep sleep, her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The number was local but unfamiliar, and her first thought was business crisis, a server failure, a breach, something that required immediate CEO attention. Mrs. Lane. The voice was calm, professional. "This is Dr. Martinez at Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Max." The words hit her like ice water. She was instantly completely awake. "What happened? Is he—" "Max is stable," Dr. Martinez said quickly. "He has a broken arm and some bruises, but he's going to be fine. However, I need you to come to the hospital right away." Veronica was already out of bed, grabbing clothes from her closet. What happened? Where was his nanny? Why didn't anyone call me earlier? "Mrs. Lane, Max was brought in by a Mr. Marcus Johnson about an hour ago. He's been staying with Max since we couldn't reach you immediately. Your home phone went to voicemail and your office emergency line. Marcus brought him in." She stopped, pulling on her jeans. Why was Marcus with Max at 3 in the morning? "I think Mr. Johnson can explain the situation better than I can. The important thing is that Max received immediate medical attention, and he's asking for you." The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of worst-case scenarios and self-recrimination. She checked on Max before bed at 10 p.m. He'd been sleeping peacefully in his room, Rachel long gone for the day. How had he ended up with Marcus, and why hadn't she heard her home phone ring? She found them in room 314. Max was sitting up in a hospital bed, his left arm in a bright blue cast, while Marcus dozed in an uncomfortable-looking chair beside him. Both were still wearing their pajamas, and Marcus's hair was sticking up at odd angles, like he'd dressed in a hurry. "Mommy!" Max's face lit up when he saw her, and the relief in his voice made her throat tight. "Oh, baby, what happened?" She rushed to his bedside, carefully hugging him around his cast. "I fell out of the tree in the backyard," Max said matter-of-factly. "I heard a noise and went to look, and I climbed the oak tree to see better, but I slipped." "What noise? What were you doing outside at night?" She looked at Marcus, who was now awake and watching the reunion with tired eyes. "And how did you—" "Max came to my house," Marcus said quietly. "It was around 1:30. He was crying and holding his arm, saying he'd hurt himself and couldn't find anyone at home." Veronica stared at him. "That's impossible. The house has a security system. Max knows. He's not supposed to leave at night." "Mom," Max interrupted, his voice small. "I know the code. I've watched you put it in lots of times, and I know about the kitchen door that doesn't always latch right." The kitchen door. She'd been meaning to have it fixed for weeks, but it hadn't seemed urgent. The security system would beep if it opened, but Max was right. He'd observed her putting in the code countless times during their brief morning interactions. "But why did you go outside?" she asked. "Why didn't you call for help?" Max looked down at his cast, suddenly, fascinated by the signatures that Marcus and Zoe had already added to it. "There wasn't anyone to call for. Rachel left after dinner, and you were in your office with your big headphones on. I knocked on your door, but you didn't hear me. The noise-canceling headphones. She wore them during late-night conference calls, to avoid disturbing Max. Last night, she'd been on a call with the team in Singapore until after midnight, completely isolated from any sound in the house." "What was the noise that made you go outside?" "I thought maybe someone was trying to break in, or maybe an animal was hurt. I wanted to check, to make sure we were safe." Max's voice got smaller. "I thought I could handle it by myself." The full picture was starting to form, and it made Veronica feel sick. Max had heard something outside, had tried to get her attention, had been unable to reach her, and had taken it upon himself to investigate. Her 6-year-old son had felt responsible for protecting their house because she'd been unreachable. "Max, honey, You should never go outside alone at night, no matter what you hear. And if you can't reach me, you should call 911. I don't know how to use the phone for 911, Max admitted. I know how to use my tablet and the kitchen phone for calling pizza, but Rachel always handles emergencies. Another failure. She'd never taught her son how to call for help in a real emergency. She delegated that responsibility to a series of nannies, assuming they'd cover the basics. How did you know to go to Marcus's house? She asked. Marcus said if I ever needed help and couldn't find a grown-up, I could come to his house any time. Day or night. He said that's what neighbors do, they help each other. Max looked between his mother and Marcus. He didn't even seem mad that I woke him up. He just put a towel around my arm and drove really fast to the hospital. Veronica looked at Marcus, who was watching this conversation with an expression she couldn't read. You told him he could come to your house any time? I did, Marcus said, simply because I could see that Max spends a lot of time without reliable adult supervision, and I wanted him to know he had somewhere safe to go if he needed help. The words stung because they were true. Despite all her careful planning and expensive childcare, Max had been functionally alone when he needed help most, and a neighbor she barely knew had been the one to provide the safety net she'd failed to create. Mrs. Lane, a woman in a navy suit, had appeared in the doorway. I'm Jennifer Wells from Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you about Max's care. Veronica's blood went cold. Child Protective Services? It's routine when a child is brought to the emergency room without a parent or guardian present. Ms. Wells explained, entering the room with a clipboard and the carefully neutral expression of someone who'd seen too many family crises. I need to ask some questions about Max's living situation and supervision arrangements. What followed was the most humiliating hour of Veronica's life. Sitting in a hospital family conference room, she had to explain to a social worker why her son had been unsupervised at night, why he didn't know basic safety procedures, why his primary caregiver couldn't be reached in an emergency. She had to acknowledge that Max had been essentially alone in their house for hours, and that this wasn't the first time, according to Max's careful answers to Ms. Wells's questions, that he'd been left to handle problems by himself. Max is clearly well loved and well provided for, Ms. Wells said finally, reviewing her notes, but there are some concerns about supervision and emergency procedures that need to be addressed. What kind of concerns? Veronica asked, though she was afraid she already knew. The pattern of inadequate supervision, Max's lack of knowledge about basic safety procedures, and his statement that he often handles things by himself when problems arise. Ms. Wells looked up from her clipboard. I'm going to recommend family assessment and mandatory parenting classes. If these issues aren't resolved within 6 months, we'll need to reconsider Max's current living arrangement. The room felt like it was spinning. Are you saying you might take Max away from me? I'm saying that Max's safety and well-being are our primary concerns. Right now, those concerns aren't being adequately addressed. Ms. Wells's voice was kind, but firm. You have resources that many parents don't: financial stability, education, community support. The question is whether you're using those resources to ensure Max's actual safety, not just his material well-being. When they returned to Max's room, Marcus was reading him a story from a book he'd apparently retrieved from the hospital's children's library. Max was laughing at Marcus's silly voices for the different characters, his earlier fear forgotten in the comfort of adult attention and care. Mr. Johnson, Ms. Wells said, I understand you've been providing informal support for Max. I've been helping out when needed, Marcus confirmed, not taking his eyes off Max. Max is a good kid. He just needs more consistent adult presence in his life. Would you be willing to serve as a character reference for the family during our assessment process? Marcus looked at Veronica for a long moment before answering. Yes, he said finally. I think Veronica loves Max very much. She just needs to learn how to show it in ways that keep him safe. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Max, clutching His discharge papers and a balloon from the nurse's station, he looked up at his mother with serious eyes. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry I scared you, but I'm glad Marcus was there to help." "I'm glad too," Veronica said, and meant it, but the gratitude was mixed with shame that a stranger had been more available to her son in a crisis than she had been. The custody evaluation document arrived by certified mail on a Monday morning, its official letterhead and legal language making Veronica's coffee taste like ash. She read through the requirements while sitting in her home office, the same office where she'd been unreachable the night Max broke his arm. Court-mandated family assessment, parenting effectiveness evaluation, supervised visitation pending completion of required coursework. The words blurred together as her hands shook. At the bottom of the document, in bureaucratic black and white, was the timeline. 6 months to demonstrate substantial improvement in parenting practices and child supervision. 6 months to prove she deserved to keep her son. Veronica set the document down and called her assistant. "Cancel all my meetings for the week," she said, ignoring the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Reschedule the board presentation. Move the client calls to next month. Mrs. Lane, the Hartwell merger presentation is Thursday." "I said cancel everything." Veronica's voice was steadier than she felt. "I'm taking a leave of absence." The silence stretched until her assistant found her voice. "For how long?" Veronica looked at the custody document with its precise requirements and unforgiving timeline. "However long it takes." The parenting classes were held in the basement of St. Mary's Community Center, in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Veronica arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business attire, and surveyed her fellow attendees with the analytical eye she usually reserved for board meetings. There was Maria, a young single mother whose 3-year-old had been found wandering in a parking lot. James, a divorced father who'd left his 8-year-old alone for 2 days during a bender. Sandra, whose twins had been living primarily on cereal and fast food because she worked 3 jobs and had no time for meal planning. Each story was different, but the common thread was clear. Parents who loved their children but had lost their way. "Welcome to Effective Parenting in Crisis," said the instructor, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that suggested she'd heard every parenting disaster imaginable. "Before we begin, I want everyone to understand that being here doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a parent who's willing to learn." The first lesson was about emotional availability, the difference between being physically present and being emotionally accessible. Dr. Hendricks had them do an exercise where they tracked their interactions with their children over a typical week, noting not just time spent together, but quality of attention given. Veronica's chart was devastating in its honesty. Hours of physical proximity while she worked on her laptop. Dinners where she reviewed emails between bites. Bedtime routines rushed through while mentally preparing for the next day's meetings. Max had been in her presence constantly, but she'd been truly present with him almost never. "Children don't need perfect parents," Dr. Hendricks explained during the second week. "They need consistent, emotionally available parents. They need to know that when they reach for you, you'll reach back." After class, Veronica found herself walking to Marcus's house instead of driving straight home. She'd been doing this more often lately, seeking his perspective on the parenting skills she was learning, asking for advice about implementing the techniques Dr. Hendricks taught. Marcus was in his driveway, teaching Max and Zoe how to change a tire on his truck. Both children were covered in a light coating of dirt and grease, completely absorbed in the lesson about jack placement and lug nut rotation. "Is this what counts as quality time?" Veronica asked, watching Max struggle with a wrench that was too big for his hands. "This is life skills disguised as play," Marcus replied, steadying the jack while Zoe turned the handle. "They're learning something useful, spending time with an adult who's paying attention to them and getting the satisfaction of accomplishing something real." My parenting instructor says I need to focus on meaningful engagement instead of educational enrichment. I'm still figuring out the difference. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her seriously. Educational enrichment is taking Max to the Science Museum and explaining how the exhibits work. Meaningful engagement is building a volcano in your backyard and watching him figure out how baking soda and vinegar work together. But he learns more at the museum. He learns facts at the museum. He learns confidence and curiosity in your backyard. Marcus knelt down to help Max with the wrench. Show me what you learned. About leverage, buddy. Max applied the lesson Marcus had just taught him, and this time the lug nut turned. His face lit up with pride and accomplishment in a way that reminded Veronica of the day she'd found him playing in Marcus's kiddie pool. Pure joy in simple achievement. I'm scared, Veronica admitted suddenly. I'm scared I've damaged him somehow. I'm scared it's too late to fix what I've broken. Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the children work. You know what Max told me last week? He said he was proud that his mom was learning new things, just like he learns new things at school. He said it made him feel special that you were working so hard to be a better mom. He said that? Kids are resilient, Veronica, and they forgive. Easier than adults do. Max doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be present. The next week, instead of hiring a new nanny to replace Rachel, Veronica decided to handle Max's after-school care herself. She picked him up from school every day, took him to the park, helped him with homework at the kitchen table instead of delegating it to a tutor. She learned to read the difference between his genuine tiredness and his boredom, his actual hunger and his desire for attention. The business world reacted to her absence with predictable panic. Her phone rang constantly with urgent matters that couldn't wait, crises that required immediate CEO attention, decisions that only she could make. For the first time in her adult life, she let most of the calls go to voicemail. The Singapore deal is falling apart, her business partner Tom informed her during one of their weekly check-ins. The clients are asking where you are, and frankly, so is the board of directors. Tell them I'm handling a family emergency, Veronica said, watching Max and Zoe build an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and blankets in her living room. For 3 months? For as long as it takes. Veronica, you built this company from nothing. You can't just walk away. I'm not walking away. I'm learning to balance. She paused as Max's laughter echoed from the living room. When had her house ever been filled with that kind of sound? The company will survive without me for a few months. Max might not. The custody evaluation process was intrusive and thorough. Social workers interviewed Max's teachers, his pediatrician, neighbors, anyone who had regular contact with him. They observed Veronica's interactions with Max, assessed their home environment, reviewed her work schedule and childcare arrangements. The interviews were particularly difficult. Max, in his honest 6-year-old way, described their life before the changes she'd implemented. The rotating nannies, the scheduled interactions, the times he'd felt scared or lonely or unsure who to ask for help. But Mom is different now, he told the social worker earnestly. She picks me up from school every day, and we talk about funny things, not just homework. And she taught me how to call 911 and how to make scrambled eggs, and last week we built a bird feeder for the backyard. During one particularly difficult evaluation session, the social worker asked Max to draw a picture of his family. He drew 2 pictures, one labeled before, showing a woman at a computer and a small boy sitting alone, and another labeled now, showing a woman and boy holding hands, with Marcus and Zoe in the background. The evolution was stark and telling. Mrs. Lane, the social worker said after reviewing the drawings, Max clearly loves you very much, but these pictures show a significant change in his perception of family stability. Can you maintain these improvements long term? It was the question that kept Veronica awake at night. She'd proven she could step away from work temporarily, could be present and available when Max needed her, but what happened when the evaluation period ended? Would she slide back into old patterns? Would the demands of her business pull her away from the connections she'd worked so hard to build? The business pressure was becoming unbearable. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss her extended absence. 2 major clients had terminated their contracts, citing concerns about leadership stability. Her stock options were losing value as investor confidence wavered. "You're going to lose everything you've built," Tom warned her during their final conversation before the board meeting. 5 years from now, when Max is older and more independent, you'll regret throwing away your life's work." "No," Veronica said, watching Max practice his whistling technique, still not quite achieving the desired sound, but improving every day. 5 years from now, I'll regret throwing away his childhood. The company can be rebuilt. These years with Max can't be recovered." 2 weeks before the final custody hearing, Marcus made an announcement that surprised everyone. He'd been offered a supervisory position with a large construction company in Denver. Better pay, career advancement, opportunity for Zoe to attend a specialized school for academically gifted children. "I haven't accepted yet," he told Veronica as they watched the children play in his backyard. "Zoe loves it here, and I hate to disrupt her stability, but it's a good opportunity." Veronica felt panic rise in her throat. Marcus and Zoe had become integral parts of Max's world, and more importantly, Marcus had become her guide through the transformation she'd undergone. The idea of losing his steady presence and practical wisdom felt overwhelming. "Max will be devastated," she said. "Max will be fine," Marcus corrected gently. "He has you now, really has you. That's what he needed most." "What about me?" she asked, surprising herself with the vulnerability in her voice. "I still need your help figuring this out." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Veronica, you've already figured it out. You've learned how to put Max first. You've learned how to be present. You've learned how to balance work and family." He smiled. "You don't need me to tell you how to be a good mother anymore." The final week before the custody hearing passed, in a blur of preparation, anxiety, and the strange peace that comes from having done everything possible to change a situation. Veronica had completed her parenting classes, demonstrated consistent improvement in her relationship with Max, and fundamentally restructured her life around her son's needs. But the question remained, would it be enough to convince a judge that she deserved to maintain custody of the child she'd nearly lost through neglect? The family courthouse on Maple Street looked nothing like the sleek corporate buildings where Veronica usually conducted high-stakes negotiations. The waiting room was filled with mismatched chairs, fluorescent lighting, and the quiet desperation of families in crisis. Veronica sat in one of those uncomfortable chairs, wearing her most conservative suit, trying to project confidence while her stomach twisted with anxiety. Max sat beside her, unusually quiet in his best clothes, the navy blazer she'd bought for special occasions, but rarely had reason to use. His small hand found hers, and she squeezed it gently, drawing strength from his calm presence. "Mrs. Lane." A court clerk appeared with a clipboard. "Judge Morrison is ready for your hearing." The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic legal settings she'd seen in movies. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind but serious eyes, reviewed the thick file of documents that represented 6 months of scrutiny into Veronica's fitness as a parent. "Mrs. Lane," Judge Morrison began, "I've reviewed the extensive documentation provided by Child Protective Services, your parenting instructor, and various character witnesses. This hearing will determine whether the temporary custody arrangement should be modified and what ongoing supervision, if any, will be required." Veronica nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "We'd like to start by hearing from Max himself," the judge continued, looking at the small boy who seemed even smaller in the formal courtroom setting. "Max, do you understand why we're here today?" Max looked at his mother, then back at the judge. "You're deciding if I get to keep living with my mom," he said in his clear, serious voice. "That's right, and I want to ask you some questions about how things have been at home. Is that okay?" Max nodded solemnly. "6 months ago, when you got hurt and went to the hospital, you told the social worker that you sometimes felt scared or lonely at home. How do you feel now?" Max thought about this carefully, the way he approached all important questions. "Now I feel safe," he said. "My mom picks me up from school every day and we talk about stuff. She taught me how to make pancakes and how to call for help if I need it, and she laughs at my jokes now." "What kind of stuff do you talk about?" "Everything. Like yesterday, we talked about why dogs wag their tails and whether astronauts get homesick in space and what my favorite memory is from this whole year." Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. "What is your favorite memory from this year?" "The day Mum came home early and found me playing with Marcus in the kiddie pool. Not because I was in trouble, but because that's when everything started to get better." Veronica felt tears prick her eyes. The day that had felt like such a failure, such a moment of shame and panic, had been the beginning of their real relationship in Max's mind. "Max," the judge continued, "if you could change anything about your life now, what would it be?" Max was quiet for a long moment. "I would want Marcus and Zoe to not move to Denver. But Mom says sometimes people have to make hard choices for their families, and we have to respect that even when it makes us sad." Judge Morrison made notes on her legal pad. "Thank you, Max. You can go sit with your mom now." As Max returned to his seat, the judge called Jennifer Wells, the social worker who had been overseeing their case. Ms. Wells presented her findings methodically, documented improvements in supervision and safety measures, successful completion of parenting classes, evidence of consistent emotional availability and appropriate boundary setting. Mrs. Lane has made substantial, measurable changes in her parenting practices, Ms. Wells testified. Max is thriving academically and socially. The home environment is now stable and nurturing. However, I do have concerns about long-term sustainability given Mrs. Lane's professional demands. "What specific concerns?" Judge Morrison asked. Mrs. Lane took a complete leave of absence from her business to focus on these improvements. While admirable, it's not clear whether these changes can be maintained when she returns to work. The pattern of overcommitment to professional obligations was a significant factor in the original neglect issues. Next came Dr. Hendricks from the parenting program, who spoke about Veronica's engagement with the coursework and her demonstrated understanding of child development principles. Then Max's teacher, who described the positive changes she'd observed in his behavior and academic performance. Finally, Marcus was called to testify. He walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence he'd shown that first day in Veronica's driveway, wearing a suit that was clearly borrowed but clean and well-fitted. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Morrison said, "you've observed this family's situation from a unique perspective. In your opinion, is Max safe in Mrs. Lane's care?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "Absolutely." "Can you elaborate on that assessment?" Marcus looked at Veronica, then at Max before answering. 6 months ago, Veronica was trying to be a perfect provider instead of being a present parent. She thought love meant giving Max everything money could buy, but Max needed something money can't buy, her attention and emotional connection. And now she understands that being a good parent isn't about being perfect or having all the resources. It's about showing up consistently, being emotionally available, and putting your child's needs ahead of your own comfort or convenience. Marcus paused. Veronica has proven she can do that. Judge Morrison made more notes, then looked up at Veronica. "Mrs. Lane, I'd like to hear from you directly. What assurances can you give this court that the improvements documented over the past 6 months will continue?" The family courthouse on Maple Street looked nothing like the sleek corporate buildings where Veronica usually conducted high-stakes negotiations. The waiting room was filled with mismatched chairs, fluorescent lighting, and the quiet desperation of families in crisis. Veronica sat in one of those uncomfortable chairs, wearing her most conservative suit, trying to project confidence while her stomach twisted with anxiety. Max sat beside her, unusually quiet in his best clothes, the navy blazer she'd bought for special occasions, but rarely had reason to use. His small hand found hers, and she squeezed it gently, drawing strength from his calm presence. "Mrs. Lane?" A court clerk appeared with a clipboard. "Judge Morrison is ready for your hearing." The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic legal settings she'd seen in movies. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind but serious eyes, reviewed the thick file of documents that represented 6 months of scrutiny into Veronica's fitness as a parent. "Mrs. Lane," Judge Morrison began, "I've reviewed the extensive documentation provided by Child Protective Services, your parenting instructor, and various character witnesses. This hearing will determine whether the temporary custody arrangement should be modified and what ongoing supervision, if any, will be required." Veronica nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I'd like to start by hearing from Max himself," the judge continued, looking at the small boy who seemed even smaller in the formal courtroom setting. "Max, do you understand why we're here today?" Max looked at his mother, then back at the judge. "You're deciding if I get to keep living with my mom," he said in his clear, serious voice. "That's right, and I want to ask you some questions about how things have been at home. Is that okay?" Max nodded solemnly. "6 months ago, when you got hurt and went to the hospital, you told the social worker that you sometimes felt scared or lonely at home. How do you feel now?" Max thought about this carefully, the way he approached all important questions. "Now, I feel safe," he said. "My mom picks me up from school every day, and we talk about stuff. She taught me how to make pancakes and how to call for help if I need it. And she laughs at my jokes now." "What kind of stuff do you talk about?" "Everything. Like yesterday, we talked about why dogs wag their tails, and whether astronauts get homesick in space, and what my favorite memory is from this whole year." Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. "What is your favorite memory from this year?" "The day Mom came home early and found me playing with Marcus in the kiddie pool. Not because I was in trouble, but because that's when everything started to get better." Veronica felt tears prick her eyes. The day that had felt like such a failure, such a moment of shame and panic, had been the beginning of their real relationship in Max's mind. "Max," the judge continued, "if you could change anything about your life now, what would it be?" Max was quiet for a long moment. "I would want Marcus and Zoe to not move to Denver. But Mom says sometimes people have to make hard choices for their families, and we have to respect that even when it makes us sad." Judge Morrison made notes on her legal pad. "Thank you, Max. You can go sit with your mom now." As Max returned to his seat, the judge called Jennifer Wells, the social worker who had been overseeing their case. Ms. Wells presented her findings methodically. Documented improvements in supervision and safety measures, successful completion of parenting classes, evidence of consistent emotional availability and appropriate boundary setting. Mrs. Lane has made substantial, measurable changes in her parenting practices, Ms. Wells testified. Max is thriving academically and socially. The home environment is now stable and nurturing. However, I do have concerns about long-term sustainability given Mrs. Lane's professional demands. "What specific concerns?" Judge Morrison asked. Mrs. Lane took a complete leave of absence from her business to focus on these improvements. While admirable, it's not clear whether these changes can be maintained when she returns to work. The pattern of overcommitment to professional obligations was a significant factor in the original neglect issues. Next came Dr. Hendricks from the parenting program, who spoke about Veronica's engagement with the coursework and her demonstrated understanding of child development principles. Then Max's teacher, who described the positive changes she'd observed in his behavior and academic performance. Finally, Marcus was called to testify. He walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence he'd shown that first day in Veronica's driveway, wearing a suit that was clearly borrowed but clean and well-fitted. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Morrison said, "you've observed this family situation from a unique perspective. In your opinion, is Max safe in Mrs. Lane's care?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "Absolutely." "Can you elaborate on that assessment?" Marcus looked at Veronica, then at Max before answering. 6 months ago, Veronica was trying to be a perfect provider instead of being a present parent. She thought love meant giving Max everything money could buy, but Max needed something money can't buy, her attention and emotional connection. And now she understands that being a good parent isn't about being perfect or having all the resources. It's about showing up consistently, being emotionally available, and putting your child's needs ahead of your own comfort or convenience. Marcus paused. "Veronica has proven she can do that." Judge Morrison made more notes, then looked up at Veronica. "Mrs. Lane, I'd like to hear from you directly. What assurances can you give this court that the improvements documented over the past 6 months will continue?" Veronica stood slowly, her legs unsteady as she approached the witness stand. This was the moment everything depended on. Her ability to convince a judge that she had fundamentally changed, not just temporarily adjusted her behavior to meet. "And court requirements, Your Honor," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "6 months ago, I thought I was being a good mother by providing Max with every material advantage I could afford. I hired the best nannies, enrolled him in the best schools, filled his schedule with enriching activities. I worked 16-hour days to build a company that would secure his financial future." She paused, looking at Max, who was watching her with complete attention. "What I didn't understand was that in trying to give him everything, I was giving him nothing of what he actually needed. I was so focused on providing for his future that I was missing his childhood entirely." Judge Morrison nodded for her to continue. "The night Max broke his arm was the worst night of my life, but it was also the most important. It forced me to confront the truth that a stranger, Marcus Johnson, was more available to my son in a crisis than I was. That Max had learned to handle problems by himself because he couldn't rely on me to be present when he needed help." Veronica's voice caught slightly, but she continued. "I realized I had to choose between being a successful CEO and being a successful mother, and there was no choice. Max is more important than any business deal, more valuable than any amount of money, more precious than any professional achievement." "Mrs. Lane," the judge interjected, "the social worker expressed concern about your ability to maintain these changes when you return to work. How do you address that concern?" This was the moment Veronica had been preparing for, the question that would determine not just the custody decision, but the entire direction of her future. "Your Honor, I've made a decision that I want to formalize here in court, so there's no question about my commitment." Veronica reached into her purse and pulled out a document she'd prepared weeks ago, but hadn't been sure she'd have the courage to present. "This is my formal resignation from my position as CEO of Lane Technologies, effective immediately." A murmur went through the small courtroom. Max's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like hope. "I'm not abandoning my business," Veronica continued, "but I'm stepping back from daily operations to focus on what matters most. I've restructured my role to advisory capacity, which will provide sufficient income while allowing me to be present for Max's childhood." Judge Morrison reviewed the resignation document. "This is a significant professional sacrifice, Mrs. Lane. Are you certain this decision isn't driven by the pressure of these proceedings?" "I'm certain it's the right decision, regardless of these proceedings," Veronica replied. "Over the past 6 months, I've learned what it feels like to really know my son, his sense of humor, his fears, his dreams, his daily joys and struggles. I've learned what it feels like to be the person he reaches for when he needs comfort or wants to share excitement. That relationship is worth more than any professional achievement." She looked directly at Max, speaking to him as much as to the judge. I used to think success meant building something that would last forever. Now I understand that the most important thing I'll ever build is my relationship with Max, and that relationship requires daily attention, consistent presence, and prioritizing his needs above my own ambitions. The judge made extensive notes before speaking again. Mr. Johnson testified that you've learned the difference between being a provider and being a parent. Can you explain what that means to you? Being a provider means making sure Max has everything he needs to succeed academically and financially, Veronica said. Being a parent means making sure he has everything he needs to feel loved, secure, and emotionally connected to his family. For years, I focused entirely on providing while neglecting the fundamental work of parenting. And how has that changed? Now I understand that Max doesn't need the most expensive activities or the most impressive educational opportunities. He needs consistency, attention, and the security of knowing that when he reaches for me, I'll be there. He needs a mother who values his happiness as much as his achievement, who sees him as a whole person rather than a project to be optimized. Judge Morrison looked at her notes, then at Max, then back at Veronica. Mrs. Lane, the evidence presented today demonstrates significant improvement in your parenting practices and genuine commitment to maintaining those changes. However, given the severity of the original neglect issues, this court will require ongoing monitoring. Veronica's heart sank. Ongoing monitoring meant continued social worker visits, continued questions about her fitness as a parent, continued uncertainty about their future. Therefore, the judge continued, I'm ordering a 6-month follow-up evaluation to ensure these positive changes are sustained. Assuming no regression in parenting practices, full custody will be restored at that time with no further court supervision. Required relief flooded through Veronica so powerfully that she had to grip the witness stand to keep from swaying. Not the complete vindication she'd hoped for, but a clear path forward. 6 more months to prove that her transformation was permanent, not performative. Thank you, Your Honor, she managed to say. As they left the courthouse, Max slipped his hand into hers and looked up with a smile that could have powered the entire building. Mom, he said, are you really not going to be CEO anymore? Really? What are you going to be instead? Veronica squeezed his hand and smiled back at him. I'm going to be your mom, full-time. 6 months later, Veronica stood in her kitchen making pancakes while Max sat at the counter reading her the sports scores from the morning paper, a weekend tradition they'd developed after discovering his unexpected talent for dramatic news delivery. The early morning light streaming through the windows illuminated a home that had been transformed not by renovation or decoration, but by the presence of genuine family life. The Lakers lost again, Max announced with the gravity of a seasoned sportscaster. Coach says they need to work on teamwork. Sounds like good advice for everyone, Veronica replied, flipping a pancake with the competence of someone who'd learned. Through practice rather than delegation, the kitchen, once a showpiece rarely used except for catered events, now bore the comfortable signs of daily life. Art projects taped to the refrigerator, a collection of coffee mugs with chips and personal significance, a fruit bowl that was actually used for fruit instead of decoration. The final court hearing had been a formality. The social worker's 6-month follow-up report had documented sustained improvements in every area of concern: consistent supervision, appropriate emergency procedures, emotional availability, work-life balance. Judge Morrison had officially closed the case with congratulations and a reminder that parenting was a lifelong commitment, not a temporary project. Mom, Max said, interrupting her thoughts. Marcus called. He and Zoe are driving through town today on their way to visit. Zoe's grandparents, can they stop by? Of course they can stop by, Veronica said. Though the mention of Marcus still brought mixed emotions. He'd taken the job in Denver after all. And while she genuinely believed it was the right decision for his family, she missed his steady presence and practical wisdom more than she'd expected. The doorbell rang an hour later, and Max raced to answer it with the enthusiasm of a child who'd learned that unexpected visitors usually brought joy rather than disruption. Zoe burst through the door first, chattering about their road trip and the collection of state license plates they'd been spotting, while Marcus followed with the patient smile of a parent who'd been listening to travel commentary for several hundred miles. "Veronica," Marcus said, accepting her offer of coffee and settling into the kitchen chair that had somehow become his designated seat during his months of informal involvement in their lives. "You look good. Relaxed." She did feel relaxed in a way she'd never experienced during her CEO years. Her current work with the non-profit technology foundation she'd established was challenging and meaningful, but it operated within boundaries that preserved her availability for Max. She earned less money, but slept better at night. She had fewer professional accolades, but more genuine satisfaction. "How's Denver treating you?" she asked, watching Max and Zoe disappear into the backyard, where they'd immediately begun planning some elaborate game involving the tree swing Marcus had helped her install. "Good. Different, but good. Zoe loves her new school, and the job is exactly what I hoped it would be." Marcus paused, stirring sugar into his coffee with the thoughtful slowness that characterized most of his actions. "But I miss this. Miss being part of your journey." "You'll always be part of our journey," Veronica said, meaning it completely. "What you taught me about parenting, about presence, about what really matters, that doesn't disappear because you moved to Denver." They talked for an hour about the changes in both their lives, the challenges and successes of single parenthood, the ways children grew and adapted and surprised their adults with resilience and wisdom. It was the kind of conversation Veronica had never made time for during her corporate years. Unhurried, meandering, focused on connection rather than productivity. When it was time for Marcus and Zoe to continue their journey, Max hugged them, both with the fierce intensity of a child who'd learned not to take relationships for granted. As their car pulled away, he waved until it disappeared around the corner, then turned to his mother with the philosophical acceptance that children sometimes display about life's changes. "I'm sad they live far away," he said, "but I'm glad they're happy." Later that evening, after Max had gone to bed and Veronica was tidying the kitchen, she found herself looking at the refrigerator gallery of his artwork, school achievements, and candid photos that had accumulated over the months. Among them was the picture Marcus had taken on their last day together, the first photograph of Veronica and Max, where both were genuinely, unself-consciously happy. In the photo, they're sitting on the back porch steps, sharing an ice cream cone, and laughing at something Max had just said. Veronica's hair is messy from an afternoon of playing outside. Her clothes are casual and slightly grass-stained, and she looks nothing like the polished executive she'd once been. She looks instead like a mother. Her phone buzzed with a text from her own mother, with whom she'd reconnected during her months of transformation. "Saw the article about your foundation in the Business Journal," it read. "Proud of the work you're doing, but prouder of the mother you've become." The message was followed by a photo from her mother's garden, where she was teaching Max's cousin to plant tomatoes, a skill she'd tried to teach Veronica decades ago, before work and ambition had crowded out simpler pleasures. As Veronica turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, she passed Max's room and paused to listen to the sound of his steady breathing. He was dreaming peacefully, secure in the knowledge that when he woke up, she would be there. Not traveling for business, not locked away in her office with noise-cancelling headphones, not delegating his care to well-meaning strangers. Just there, available and present, ready for whatever the day might bring. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, driven, successful, lonely in ways she hadn't even recognized. That woman had measured her worth in quarterly earnings and stock prices, had equated love with providing rather than presence. That woman had built an empire, but had been losing the one thing that truly mattered. The transformation hadn't been easy. She'd given up financial security, professional recognition, and the intoxicating sense of importance that came with running a major corporation. But in return, she gained something infinitely more valuable. A relationship with her son built on genuine connection rather than obligation. A life balanced around what mattered rather than what impressed others. And the deep satisfaction that comes from being truly needed by someone who loves you unconditionally. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant pancakes and silly conversations and whatever adventures Max's imagination might devise. No scheduled enrichment activities, no carefully planned educational experiences, no performance metrics to meet. Just time together, unstructured and precious, and exactly what both of them needed. As she settled into bed, Veronica smiled at the realization that she'd finally learned the most important lesson of her life. Success wasn't about building something that would last forever. Success was about being present for the moments that would become memories, about choosing love over achievement, about understanding that the greatest legacy she could leave was not a business empire, but a child who knew he was cherished. Outside her window, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, filled with families sleeping safely in their homes, and in the house that had once been a showcase but was now simply a home, a mother and son rested easily, secure in their bond, and ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.